Welcome to another episode of On the Mic with Ed. You're here with myself, Maria Ortiz, and co-host Dr. Zoe Ross-Nash. We have Leah Stiles with us today, and she is a retired Navy senior chief and founder and CEO of Sea Waves. So we'll be talking about all things eating disorders in the military. Both of those topics need more discussion in conjunction with one another, so we are so thrilled to be doing this episode.
Yeah, I just want to thank you so much, Leah, for being a pioneer in having the conversation of eating disorders within the armed forces. And I also just want to thank you for your service. I know that that's a complex sentence and it's really thank you for your sacrifice, but all the above. We are so grateful to have you here and all that you've done for our country.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Yeah, well, thank you again for founding Sea Waves. It's an incredible resource for so many military families. But I would love to hear a little bit about what drew you even to this field? Like what is your relationship with food, exercise, body image, especially during the time in the military? And when did you even first notice it was a struggle?
So I get that question a lot because I think there's been a lot of assumption that I developed my eating disorder when I was in the military. But I actually was diagnosed with my eating disorder at 11. I was 11. And so I came into the military more eating disorder informed. So I think I came in with like a different lens in being able to see and see what's there, see what's not there, really see the gaps in conversation and knowledge and resources. And so that really became something that grew, over my 20 years in service. And I used to always like think or hope or wish that somebody else would start like a similar organization or something like that. So when I retired and did a lot of like, that transition and that soul searching and, complaining to a mentor that there's just such a gap around all these things and the knowledge and the resources. And he just looked at me and said, if not you, then who? And I didn't have a good response. So there we are. That's what led us to that was, you know, it, at least I could create something.
Yeah, something and something huge, something that's so special and needed. I love that if not you, then who? And also that like you took the call and you said, I'm on it. So I think that is just so incredible and it's helping so many individuals in a very niche area. Niche in the sense of not being discussed, not niche in the sense of it not being like widely needed. So I'm interested, obviously, the military is very strict, like physical fitness demands. So I'm very, very curious how those expectations like impacted your relationship with fitness, food, your body, all the things.
Yes, I think that it gave me a justification, right? I think that I would have probably, continued on the way that I was. At that time, before I joined, I thought that I was in recovery. I thought that, part of me was behind me. And then, coming into the military lifestyle and those things around fitness and professionalism. And, so many people that struggle with disordered eating and eating disorders are also very high achieving people and professionals and have like that discipline. And so those things were just such a juxtaposition for me in my service because that's what made me great at being a senior chief. Well, not wasn't always a senior chief, but that's what made me great at being a sailor that led up to promoting to senior chief and doing all the things as like the discipline and the professionalism. And so the disordered behaviors, not only did I continue them because they were rewarded in a lot of different ways. They're also very much, if you will, camouflaged by a lot of things that are important to being service members, and they're also very much normalized. A lot of the disordered behaviors and the things that people do to meet these standards are quite disordered. And so when I would go through different phases of identifying like myself and like my journey of, what am I doing that is truly disordered, that kind of like temperature you have to take on yourself. It was really hard to do that assessment when around me, a lot of those behaviors are happening regularly and aren't being called out as disordered and almost just kind of being accepted. So I think it just like that kind of like makes the whole system harder to navigate because it's harder to call out what the bad parts are.
I really appreciate how you just described that. So in the military, discipline, control, and commitment are reinforced, and they're almost used as currency to get promoted, to make major, to get positions. And seeing it as a temperature of, okay, how is this interacting with my eating disorder behavior? Is this something that is benefiting me, or is there something else pathological going on, like an eating disorder? And is this inherently reinforcing the eating disorder? So taking that internal temperature can be really helpful to say, hey, what is going on here? So as we said, with the military culture, there's that discipline, control, performance hierarchy. What do you think made it easier or even harder in recognizing an eating disorder was happening just because of the community maybe enforced it?
Yes, so that's so interesting because the diagnosis that I got when I was 11 was not at all the diagnosis that I would or should have gotten, 10 years later in my life when I was active duty. In fact, that diagnosis didn't even exist yet. The DSM hadn't been updated with like OSFED or EDNOS, those. And so that was part of it too, that even when I would go to primary care and explain a lot of the behaviors that I was doing, there wasn't a diagnosis that qualified for. So, for example, I was purging regularly, daily, but I didn't qualify for the diagnosis of bulimia nervosa because I've never experienced a binge episode. Also, I would go through long periods of restriction, but I didn't qualify for anorexia diagnosis because I didn't meet the weight requirements, and we didn't have atypical anorexia, which don't get me started. I would love to talk about how those should be flipped about what's typical and what's atypical. But so that kind of didn't exist, right? So even if we had a doctor on base that had, some eating disorder, background. There also just wasn't a diagnosis that could even be like in my record. And so there's a lot of talk about, how eating disorders are non-compatible with military service, but there's also not any structure around it. There's no standard operating procedure as we would see in other things like you see with alcoholism. Like there's a standard operating procedure. If you struggle with that, you get 3 treatment failures. If you don't make it through treatment a third time, then we have to have that conversation that perhaps maybe you're not right for the military or the military is not right for you. How can we get you some treatment and help you transition into the civilian world? There's nothing that exists like that on the military side of if you get a diagnosis. And again, that's passing a few hurdles and barriers to even get to that point because we don't have any screening processes in place. There's no annual screening. There's no requested screening that you could ask for. So even if you got to that point of getting a diagnosis, then there's more hurdles and barriers to starting like your treatment plan. I don't know if I answered that question or if I opened up 5 more.
Those were some fabulous, yeah, like can of worms. I think that we need to do a segment, Zoe, of like where we clip every time that somebody references atypical anorexia and then we all like eye roll. So I really appreciate that's our like one for the episode. Because it's so true, the typical presentation, that is its own episode. But what's really sad to me and what stood out is the fact that there wasn't a protocol in place for this. The most deadly mental health disorder impacting a significant amount of individuals, and there's not a protocol. That just feels like such a missed opportunity to provide adequate care and also keep people in the military, smooth transitions for what's going on. It really just kind of feels like, why do we have protocols in place for other mental health diagnoses and struggles and not this? So I'm really, really glad that you named that. You're also kind of naming that like the symptoms might have been like noticed, quote unquote, but there wasn't like a pretty diagnosis, this little bow to wrap it up in. Do you feel like because, this environment was so focused on strength and things of that nature that your symptoms were hidden, or do you feel like they were seen and kind of just overlooked?
I would say both. I think that they were misunderstood. And I often use this example, because towards the end of my career, I had, less F's to give around hiding it. And I was miserable and I was irritable and I was malnutrition, and so I got a little bit more snappy towards the end. And I remember, a fellow chief petty officer, saying to me, I just love how on a random Wednesday you go out and run 13 miles. Like, I just love how disciplined you are. You just go on a random, like, you just go do that. Like, I love that. And I just looked at him and I snapped and I was like, I hate running. I don't like running. I had to go run a half marathon because you guys begged me to go have a pizza with you guys, and I had a slice of pizza. And so my consequence, my punishment is having to go run that. So please don't think that I was just on a pretty joy run in the middle of the afternoon. And I remember he looked at me like, oh, I was trying to like pay you a compliment, like, and I was like, I was hangry, right? And, but again, like, that's how it was just received. Like, how cool, how disciplined is she? And I want to be like that. But they didn't like even know how to process that that wasn't enjoyable for me. That was punishment.
Yeah. Wow. Again, more things that we can talk about just because the community in the military is like us, like we are armed forces and then there's civilians. So if you're not engaging in things that the rest of the team is doing, like getting a piece of pizza, you're seen as continually othered. And I did not know about the length about the three treatment fails rule. So just for our listeners, my husband's Air Force, so I'm pretty well informed about military aspects of mental health. I did not know about three treatment fails. That is
For alcoholism.
for alcoholism. Okay, oh, got it.
Yes. So I use that in comparison because there's still nothing like that for eating disorders. There's only one sentence. It just says eating disorders are non-compatible with military service.
Right.
There's nothing after that that says if you've been diagnosed with this one, or if you've been diagnosed for more than a year, or if a doctor says, like, there's nothing else provided to leadership to act on that executive order.
And talk about secrecy, right? If eating disorders are not compatible with the armed forces, well, you're not going to disclose that you have one. That is your livelihood. That is how you support your family. That is your identity. So when that is jeopardized, why would you disclose more than just your safety is being compromised? It's so complex and nuanced. And we mentioned this idea of like civilian and armed forces. And I think what's important to note is that a lot of individuals who are in the armed forces have different confidentiality rules when they are seeking help within their their squadron. So a lot of these things are not confidential if you disclose them. And then if someone does feel like your job could be potentially jeopardized or your performance in your job, they have every right to disclose that and you could ask to be to separate. And that's really scary. When you are working with a civilian provider, you do have the option to not get a diagnosis, but still, if someone wants to subpoena that, like you would have to disclose that information and then their job might be jeopardized. So there's a community and culture of secrecy that is not allowing individuals with eating disorders to get the adequate care that they need.
Absolutely. And that was my biggest frustration, of course, when I saw that executive order, be brought back out again last year, I wanted to communicate around it, because what I want to say more than anything is that's not going to leave the armed forces with less people having eating disorders. That's going to leave the armed forces with less people that have eating disorders receiving treatment. And that's far more dangerous. So we're not going to just have less, right? And then, when you tie in the overlap, everybody, everywhere I go, we're all different branches, right? And we all make fun of each other like brothers and sisters. We have like this dysfunctional family thing. But one thing that, you put us in a room, whether we're active duty, we're guard, we're veterans, we're, space code, whatever we are. One thing we are all aligned on is that we are sick of losing our brothers and sisters to suicide. And so everybody always says, like, if we could just save one more. And I'm like, well, 30% of us are struggling with an eating disorder. So if we could just get them resources and make that safe and make that okay, because we know how isolating it is. So isolation around suicide prevention and suicidality, isolation around eating disorders, not having a place that you can, access resources resources, life-saving resources. And then please don't get me started that our medical insurance doesn't pay over the age of 21 if for inpatient or residential. And so it's like we're not going to move that needle on what we're calling 22 a day, which is actually closer to 44 a day, without acknowledging this piece and the things that you said around, like, making it more difficult to disclose or to get treatment or anything like that, is absolutely playing a part in the amount of people that we're losing to suicide. There's no way to deny those numbers.
There's no way to deny those numbers, and then you follow it up with eating disorders are not compatible in the armed forces. I mean, that is just when you said that sentence, it kind of took me a second. You're right. It's kind of like, yeah, we must stop the suicides and things like that. It's like, well, if there's 30%, we also know that a lot of the deaths associated with eating disorders are from suicide. We also already take one of the most highly secretive disorders in their nature and pathology. These are already kept so close to the chest. Now you have that sentence to stare at and make a decision. Then also maybe different diagnoses that aren't even very fitting. Next, do I even have access to treatment? Well, it's not compatible. What in the world do we do here? So it seems like the most secretive disorder now just got a bit more secretive, which in my opinion sounds like it got a bit more deadly as well. And for already being the deadliest mental health disorder, that's just a horrible sentence to say.
Yeah,
So I'm
especially
so
for this
appreciative.
community.
Yeah, exactly. It's kind of it's just awful, honestly. So I'm just so grateful for your voice because you have a very profound way of sharing your story and also like knowing what you're discussing and your passion shines through. So I'm glad somebody said, if not you, then who? Because I'm glad that you took that call. So I am curious though, you faced all of what I just said there, right? With the secrecy and the pressures. Did you reach out for help? And how did you navigate kind of like the mental health care within that system?
Yes. So when all was said and done, I had my eating disorder for 30 years. And in hindsight, looking back, I would estimate that about 50% of the time I was doing exactly what you just said, Maria. I was very secretive. I was hiding it. I was even a bit manipulative, and disguising it, all those things that come with that like kind of secrecy around that. But I would say the other 50% of the time, I was dropping breadcrumbs. I was, testing out who could I have this conversation with when we would go to the Fleet and Family Service Center and they would talk about all their different groups. I mean, we have groups to quit smoking, to quit beating your spouse, to quit like all the other things. But I was like, well, where are the eating disorder groups? Like, so, half of the time I was still advocating. mm, I would say partially for myself, but I'm more of a like maternal get justice for others. So I think that was really what allowed me to kind of like drive and ask those questions, especially as I became more of a leader. And then my son, joined the Navy, and I was just like thinking like, what about the next generation too? So I mean, I was having like those conversations, and there were different times that I needed higher levels of care and that I was in treatment. The first time was literally at my halfway point, at my 10-year point. I made Chief Petty Officer, which is a big change in the Navy. You like completely change your uniform. You go through 6 weeks of initiation. It's a really big change. I also went to SEER school, which if you haven't looked into that, that's a whole adventure in itself. It's like 2 weeks, and you're also just dropped on an island and you have to survive. So like I went through like all these changes, and then I also went through like a really traumatic event where I had like a verbal altercation with my biological mother, and that resulted in her completed suicide. So at that point, my eating disorder was just at its height, and I ruptured my esophagus from purging so much. And I went to the civilian hospital because I didn't want it in my military medical record, but my command still found out about it, because I was hospitalized. So I had to come in, and when I was coming back into work after the hospital, they're like, well, the commanding officer wants to see you. And there was a piece of me that was very relieved. I had worked for this particular commanding officer for 3 years. And under him, I was the Sailor of the Year 2 consecutive years. So I knew that he knew me, he knew my work ethic, he knew my family. He had actually just got back from a deployment with my husband in Iraq. And so, like, I was like, okay, if there's anybody that's going to be able to help me, it's this guy. So I walked into his office, and normally each day we would start the day off by us sitting on the couch and talking about our command and what we're going to do. And I went to go sit, and instead he stood me at attention in front of his desk, and he said, "There's no place in my Navy for you." And then he began processing me out. And I had to get a lawyer, and I had to fight to stay in, which I did, and I did get to stay in. But I learned that I had to keep my eating disorder a secret, that I couldn't bring it to leadership. Those paths couldn't cross. So it was another 7 years until a leader spoke to me about my eating disorder.
Oh my gosh, Leah, thank you so much for your honesty and sharing that story. I actually choked up hearing about all of it, but particularly the lack of support that you had from someone that you had a deep, deep relationship with and deep respect. And I know how much integrity goes into being someone in the armed forces, and then to be dismissed in such a callous way is nauseating. And if you are listening and your jaw's on the floor of like, how could that happen? There is literally a DoD Department of Defense instruction that says that a service member's command officer must be notified if there's anything concerning about their mental health care. And there's no privacy. And especially within eating disorders, when it is incredibly important to have more control over when you disclose, who you disclose, how you disclose, there's no autonomy in that.
Wow. Yeah, no, I definitely kind of teared up as well here. And, Zoe and I do this work too. And we run these episodes and things like that. And it's not always that sort of those sentences that you said in concession with one another. I think the biggest thing that hit me too was that the hope that you held initially, it almost sounds like you felt relieved for a second of almost like, okay, he knows. And the immediate just upheaval and the complete like disarray of what actually happened. So, but also shining through, you're like, I got a lawyer and I did stay. Wow, the power like in that tone is something. I think what's really challenging too with this story is that it's layered in many facets. So it's kind of like you got to a point with your eating disorder that is highly severe as well. That was a pretty legitimate acuity there, and even then, it's not even like somebody followed up. So I think this is just such a layered problem. I think then too, so I'm kind of curious then as well. So you said even like 7 years following, there's still relationships with exercise, demands, physicality going on. How was your like relationship with all of that shaped with all of this going on?
From there, honestly, it got so much worse because at that point I was a chief petty officer. And so I felt like I was leading from the front, and I mean, I was a sailor's sailor. And so I thought, wearing that uniform of a CPO, meant the utmost pride and professionalism. And in my disordered brain, that meant being the smallest version of myself. So a lot of people think I was just trying to not fail the standards. That was just one piece of it. I didn't have to only pass what the Navy standards were. I had to pass what my eating disorder set the standards to be. And those are two different numbers. And those are two different sets of rules that are just hard to understand. So I got more, diligent, and I was absolutely excelling professionally in each thing that I did, following on beyond that. But and I look back at pictures and I'm just like, I was so blaringly sick in all the different ways and in all the different reasons. So those were like just so simultaneous for me. As I excelled professionally, my eating disorder, got to its worst. And so when it came point for me to get orders to an aircraft carrier, my orders got flagged flagged by the ship's medical because of the ruptured esophagus. And they denied my orders, but I was determined that was my dream ship. I was going to go on that ship. And so I asked to speak with the triad, the top three people, and the CO, the XO, and the CMC. And so the XO and the CO obviously were busy, but I met with the CMC, who was a former medic. He was medical, and he also had a loved one with an eating disorder. So he was very eating disorder informed, and he looked at my record. He knew exactly what that was and all those things. And he said, you know what? I'm gonna prove it. I'm gonna allow you to come to the ship. But I'm gonna put some boundaries around us. Number one, you don't purge on my ship. Number two, I can and will eat meals with you when I say, and we will. Number three, I want your labs done every 2 weeks. And I was just like, okay, yes, I'll do all those things. I'll do it. I'll do it. Like, just let me go to the ship. And I meant it. I meant it when I said that. Unfortunately, when we actually went on deployment, so when you're attached to the ship, it goes out and back for workups, it does different training things, and so I was able to try my best to kind of maintain that. But once we were on deployment, I just could not stick to that. And I mean, on deployment, I was purging probably 8 times a day. And it became very clear in my labs, in my life to him. And so he gave me like two different like warnings and try to he tried. He really did try. I was not allowing a lot of his help. In hindsight, I was hyper focused on my military family and making sure that they had what they needed on this deployment. I didn't want to leave. But halfway through deployment, he held an intervention and he said, I'm gonna medevac you back to the States and you need to be inpatient right now. And you need to go back for care. So I went back to the world's largest Navy base. And the hospital there didn't have one eating disorder informed provider in the entire hospital or up and down their chain of command. And then that's when we found out that TRICARE doesn't pay for inpatient or residential if you're over 21, and I was in my 30s. So it took a lot for me to be able to get into care to the point where in between me flying off the ship and me getting to the hospital, I almost died 3 times. So he was very correct and timely in getting me off the ship. And when I did get inpatient, I honestly lived inpatient while I was active duty the better part of 2 years in the hospital on an NG tube most of that time. And that was like literally rock bottom for me. And it makes me go back and think, kind of what we're saying. What if at my 10-year point, I got help at that point? Like, would I have needed 2 years of, stepping up and down on every level of care, back and forth? I mean, who knows? And I don't want to sound disgruntled because I don't have um anger about that leader. I know that he didn't know what he didn't know. And so I think that's the point that I just try so hard to drive home when I'm visiting bases or we do our education programs or anything like that, is that they don't know. They don't know what they don't know, but we also don't want to wait until it's a life or death situation or crisis or, worst case scenario, the suicide route when somebody feels isolated or that nobody can talk to them about what they're going through or that they'll get kicked out because then they have all the same problems, but now they don't have a job or medical insurance or, they can't provide for their family and then they still have the eating disorder.
You just brought up a lot of different things relating to the recovery process, but there's a couple that stand out that I feel like is so a lot of people can relate to. The first one is like I heard it in your voice, and you're like, and he said, "I'll do this, and we'll eat together, and there's no purging," and you're just like, "Yes, like I got this." And what it points out is when you're struggling, it's like people will look at me and be like, why won't they fight harder? Like, you just have to find something that's worth it. It's just not worth it. You could hear the worth in your tone, hearing, like, I'll do anything to be on this ship. And I think that's a big thing that people miss is that it's not about finding something that's worth it always. Sometimes this disorder is more pervasive than that. And it's not a willpower, not a determination, not I finally found the outcome worth it. So much of this is the pathology has to go through the process and has to get the appropriate treatment to actually resolve. there might be some people that if you find the right motivator, we can work towards this. But your switch like that of like, I'll do anything to, and I thought I could, and I started is just so relatable. And the other piece is kind of that resentment towards what if somebody would have helped me sooner. And whenever I'm talking with fellow individuals who are recovered themselves, I think a lot of us share that same sentiment of like almost like what could have been, how much pain could I have avoided? And so I think it's actually even okay to kind of name being disgruntled or something about this process because, as you stated earlier, there's protocols in place for other disorders, other diseases, other diagnoses that these protocols could have helped you years prior. So I think that there's validity in that as well.
And I also want to name, just echoing all of that, feeling disgruntled towards a higher officer than you feels taboo. So like even naming that out loud probably feels uncomfortable. So there are so many aspects that are just embedded in individuals' brain when they've gone through SEERS training, when they've gone through basic training, when they've elevated the ranks. Like of course our brain is going to be thinking in this capacity.
Yeah.
So I have one thing that I just want to say as a TRICARE provider. So I TRICARE is a very, very complex place to be involved in. So TRICARE is, and Leah, if I'm wrong at any time, just let me know. Um, TRICARE is split up between Tri East and Tri West, breaking up in Illinois, which is new, correct?
I don't know how new.
No, okay, new to me. So broken up, and then you have to get individually credentialed through Tri West or Tri East. And then there's different types of providers. So you can either just accept Tri West or Tri East, or you can be an authorized provider that allows people to submit super bills to get reimbursement. That's accurate?
Right.
Okay. So just naming that is way more confusing than other insurances. So a lot of providers don't even know how to interact with the interface of TRICARE. And that is causing a lot of people to not be able to get help too, because not enough civilian providers either accept TRICARE or are authorized.
Even treatment centers. Even treatment centers are really struggling with that as well. And then we have the age gap. Now, the good news is that we did get a law passed. It's called the SERV Act. But so this was passed in 2023. But it's going to do three things. The first thing it does is it raises that age, that cap at 21 up to 65. The second thing it does is it makes it easier for providers and treatment centers to even get in network. It's supposed to remove some of those hurdles and barriers. And then the third thing that it does is it makes it mandatory for military leadership to have eating disorder education. The problem is that nobody knows that this was passed into law. Like, nobody, when you call TRICARE knows, none of the treatment centers know. Even when I go base to base and I'm like, hey, I have the education that's mandatory for you and I'll give it to you for free even. And they're like, like, and nobody knows about it. So there's a lot of awareness around it. And because nobody knows about it, it's not getting like implemented, as much. And while it's not getting implemented, there are other problems that are developing from it. So unfortunately, there are providers that did go through all of those steps. They did get in network, and many of them are not getting paid.
They didn't get paid
Um,
until quarter 4 last year.
mhm.
Mhm.
Many of them are not. And so again, where's the incentive? And so then they're like, hey, like I have to actually take clients that I can like pay my bills with. Like I have to keep the lights on. So there's less places that we can go. And so, yeah, we're getting dead ends and all these like upstate New York. There's just no place, right? So we were getting, finding different alternatives of like virtual care and, all these different places. But, even just yesterday, I found that, there's a VA that was sending the veterans through community care for virtual care, and I guess Optum said we're not paying for eating disorder virtual care anymore. So everybody in that area, there's nothing geographically, for them to access, and then now there's nothing virtual that can get covered, and so then even if if it requires like a higher level of care where they got to like go to a different state to go to a residential, we're having problems even with that. So even if I get on the phone with TRICARE and I like give them the Serve Act and I'm like, no, you have to, so we get that approved, then what happens? We have a family member in another state. Now we have an active duty service member, can't get time off. Now I have to buy a flight to go. It's just so much. It's just not accessible. And so that's like the main thing, the number one thing that we do at C-Wave. So because C-Waves is an acronym, each letter stands for exactly what we do. So the first letter, the S, is the support, is we walk through that whole process with you, because the last thing that we want is somebody to say, I'm ready for support, and then go through all these hurdles and barriers because they get knocked down and they're already tired from what they're struggling with. They may have used their last bit of give an F, or motivation, or whatever it was, to pick up and find us, that we're not going to send them on their way to get another knockdown or hurdle and barrier. But those are the things that make the S part of my job extra difficult. And I'm a person that has all these connections and, knows, through TRICARE and all these different places. And so having the expectation that our service members, veterans, and family members can simply access eating disorder care on their own is not a fair expectation whatsoever.
Yeah. You made me think of also care gets disrupted frequently between frequent moves and deployment.
Yes. And then you got to hope when you get to the new duty station that you do have an eating disorder informed provider there, and we have to move everything back over. So you're right. And so that brings up such an important part to Dr. Zoe, is that this is not just our service members, which we are. We're seeing 1/3 of females and 1/5 of males, which we already talked. Those numbers are probably higher because of all the reasons why not to disclose. We're showing 30% of veterans, but we're also showing spouses and children 3 times more likely to have an eating disorder than civilian counterparts. And so all the same things, right? Of they move when we move, and what and so it also, I'll tie it all back to readiness, because this has been the conversation, right? With this fit not fat messaging, and all the things that go along with that, is it's they want to tie it to readiness. And so I argue readiness in a couple different ways. Number one, I argue readiness with low energy availability. If we're having to do things to shrink our body to meet standards, but it's causing things like brain fog, delayed decision making, delayed recovery from injury, all these things, then it's not readiness. Also, if a service member has to deploy or move or do anything and their spouse or their child is unable to access care for something with a very high mortality rate, then we can't expect that service member has their head in the game. Their family's not being treated, or has access to the right level of care. So, there's a lot of misconceptions when I call out, military standards, that I expect there, to not be any standards at all, because readiness. That couldn't be further from the truth. I actually want exactly what you want. I want a strong, ready force. I want that for all of us, right? But we have to call it what it is. And so putting like, a cute little a 3-word term on something like, oh, fit not fat, doesn't accurately describe the messaging of what you're actually trying to say around readiness. So I do a lot of myth busting around that the opposite of fit is not fat. The opposite of fat is not fit. And then in the pursuit of those things, we're actually bringing on things that do impact our readiness, like low energy availability.
You're bringing up a lot of different sort of like misconceptions, both about the military and eating disorders as a whole. What do you think are the most common misconceptions about the correlation between the two of eating disorders and military culture?
Oh, that is such a good question. I would say that a lot of people, a lot of people have asked me, do I believe that the military caused my eating disorder or causes eating disorders? And I've already said I had my eating disorder before I came in. Answer for me, easy answer, no. Do I believe that the military and the standards and all the other things cause other people's eating disorders? I would still answer no. Um, I then would follow it up with, you both know there's a ton of different reasons that somebody would develop an eating disorder. You know, there's biological, genetic, like all those different things. Do I think that the military lifestyle fuels that, exasperates that, camouflages that, makes it harder to identify? And makes it harder to do early intervention and yes, that part makes it harder, right? And exasperates a lot of the different things that come with it. Because if you look at MST, if you look at military sexual trauma, I mean, 1 in 3 females deal with MST during their service. And again, probably underreported for that as well. And we see the overlap between MST and using, disordered eating behaviors as coping mechanisms and all those other things. So I say that it kind of creates this perfect storm. And if we're not willing to do the work on the front end for prevention, for screenings, it's not gonna call out a problem that isn't there. It's not going to create something that isn't there. However, it could give us the opportunity on the front end, maybe to avoid, some of that exasperation.
Yeah. If someone is struggling and they're in the military, what is one thing that you would want to share with them?
I would say, first of all, your your life is worth having a life worth living. And I think that we lose that sometime in service. One of the people that I look up to so much, her name is Dr. Megan Quinn, and she's active duty Navy, and she served with her eating disorder. And she gave a testimony one time and said, I was more concerned about damaging my career than damaging my body or my life. And
Mm.
we get so bought into that service that we lose our own identity. That's why getting out of the military is so hard, is because we've lost our own identity. So I would start number one with remember, you deserve quality of life, and a life worth living. And then the second piece is that you don't have to do any of this alone. And we're not meant to, as human beings, we're not supposed to do any of life alone. We're just not wired that way. And so there are ways, and especially, this is where I'll give a plug for Sea Waves. Everything that we do is confidential, and everything that we do is your choice. So if you want to go to a confidential, virtual support group, we'll plug you in there. If you want to be connected with a civilian provider, we'll plug you in there. If want a podcast or a book or whatever it is, like this is like, I call it resource buffet. Take what you want, leave the rest, and maybe give some to somebody else, or know that it's there in case it comes up. But we can absolutely go about it confidentially. So in February, the last week of the month was Eating Disorder Awareness Week. And Sea Waves, we opened up free confidential screenings for the military community. And oh my goodness, like they just were so relieved to have a place that they could come ask these questions, find out, what is this? Like, is what I'm struggling with, like, is this a thing? What is the thing? And, all these different things. And so we're hoping that's one of our goals for the end of this year and moving into 27 is to be able to make that, more than just, 1 week opportunity, where we can implement that more often. But yes, that there's so many different options for resources there, and and it's not one size right fits all, and take baby steps, right? Like you don't saying I struggle with my relationship with food or I struggle with my relationship with my body does not have to mean that you're sitting in a treatment center. There's lots of different ways that you can choose from.
Yeah. Wow. I am just so grateful that something like Sea Waves exists. And I'm a proud Air Force wife, so I actually know the values of the Air Force. It's integrity, service before self, and excellence in all we do. So even the way that you were sharing about the woman that you looked up to, story, before self, that makes so much sense. Of course, that you're going to put your duty before your own well-being, and the idea of then getting help can feel like you're not doing that. But in reality, exactly as you said, when you take care of yourself, you are a better airman, marine, sailor, whatever it is. And another thing that I entered into the military community through my partner. A resiliency factor is how incredible the community is. It's truly a protective factor. So if you are experiencing an eating disorder, you are connected to what an amazing community. You described it as your brothers and your sisters, and that's exactly what they are. They're a family, and you have a family behind you that wants to support you, if you can find that person.
Yes.
Maria, any last comments before we wrap up?
I think just kind of what you even named there with like the service before self and then also the loss of identity. Is it just kind of made me think of eating disorders also say like body size and shape before self, and then eating disorders also take away an identity. And so I'm just hearing this population, for lack of clinical terms, a double whammy that is just not a good storm of, yeah, you're losing your identity through serving, and then you're losing your identity through your eating disorder, and then it is service before self, and then it is body size and shape before self. What a fight for your life. And so I'm just very grateful for your voice, for people who are fighting for their life. For anybody listening, we will link Sea Waves resources in this description as well.
Yes.
Yes, and I want to give a shameless plug so that people don't feel alone for the Battle Scars and Body Wars book. And what is great about this is it is written for people that are struggling, for family members, for clinicians, providers, and dietitians, and for military leadership. So the beginning of each chapter starts with a little C story, some of the ones we talked about right now, but then it goes into data, statistics, information, and then each chapter ends with more tools for your toolbox. So here's a different organization or a podcast or another book, things like that. So shameless plug for, and then the last three chapters kind of talks about what we talked about with the SERV Act and what it's going to take to make this so that we have standard operating procedures and protocols and all those things. So if you're like a change maker or, maybe just get it and read the last three chapters.
Well, thank you so much, Leah. This was incredible. I hope a lot of people can listen to this and know that they are not alone. Wherever you are, whoever you are, take a seat with us.